right, Aaron Parker, welcome back to our podcast.
Thank you, Tim. It's fun. I enjoy doing this podcast. I got an email the other day from someone I hadn't talked to in a while, and he was like, "Oh, like, do you have this plant in stock? And what do you have that you're excited about? And have you ever considered doing a podcast? I think you'd do a really good podcast." I was like, "Oh, yeah, I actually do a podcast now."
That's awesome. See, when I moved here, I was like, man, someone's got to do a fucking podcast about perennial plants and all this crazy shit, and here we are.
Yeah. Well, it's been fun. For a while, you were like, "Oh, you should do a podcast," and I just didn't have the drive to do it on my own and take on one more big project. But to sit down and chat with you, once every few weeks or once a month, that's really easy.
Yeah, I mean, shit, I'm going to be calling you anyway with annoying questions, so you might as well record it,
Yeah.
Make
the most of it.
How's the pandemic treating you, man?
Pretty good. I mean, I cannot complain. I know it's really, really rough for a lot of people. But for me, I have the luxury and privilege of a house and, family to hang out with and land to work on, and also work. Like, I've been getting more orders for the nursery than ever before by a long shot. So I'm just busy packing orders several hours a day and trying to get ready for the growing season at the same time.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I saw you shipping out sea kale rhizomes. So wait, are sea kale, are they evergreen here, or do they die down to the root and come back every year?
They pretty much died down to the root. I had one that I just dumped a whole ton of leaves on that still had last year's leaves on it because it was so insulated by all the mulch I put on it. But for the most part, they die back to the crown. But yeah, people have been really excited about sea kale this year. I've sold several hundred root cuttings.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I was waiting for a lot of other stuff is popping, but my sea kale hasn't come back. And I was like, fuck, did I fuck this up again?
No, none of mine have started putting out leaves yet either. They're a little on the slow side, but even if the crown is just completely dead, the plant will probably come back from the roots that are lower in the ground, that are a little more protected.
That's awesome. I can't wait, man. It's amazing just watching all these perennials from books come to life all around.
Yeah, isn't it great?
Yeah, which I'm sure you know.
Yeah, I love it.
Well, so I got a lot of great feedback on the Wonderful Time to Start a Garden podcast. I guess, we felt like there was some stuff that got left out or stuff that, could help people further along as the season progresses. So,
Yeah, definitely. And when we did that podcast, it started off as like, okay, we're going to talk for like 15 minutes about like how to get a garden started as an intro to the Joseph Lofthouse episode. And it ended up being like over an hour. And it was mostly just kind of off the top of my head. So I definitely missed some points that I, looking back, see as kind of key points. And I said a lot and had a lot of pauses. So now I have a sort of bullet point list of like, I should make sure that I don't forget to talk about this, this, and this. So hopefully it'll be a little more structured and fill in the gaps.
Yeah, I totally forgot that. It was like we were just going to record an intro, and then we realized that like there was so much cool stuff in the Joseph Lofthouse thing that it was like there were two different things. So such is life, that's art. It's how art works, man. It's magic.
Just gotta roll with it.
Can't control it. So, what was there anything specifically that like glared out to you that you felt like remiss about, or stuff that you felt like we really
Yeah. So the first thing that popped out at me was at some point in the last episode, I was like, well, this is what you do, assuming you have a yard. And then didn't really address what some other options are if you don't have a yard and you don't have your own space to grow in. So one of the most obvious options is community garden plots. In a normal year, you might have a good chance of getting one. I think the availability of community garden plots is going to be pretty limited. But there are a lot of projects popping up around more collectively organized community gardens, and as a community self-sufficiency or COVID pandemic resiliency thing. I know there are people all over the country and likely all over the world that are planting a big vegetable garden as a group. So looking into that locally, if that's something that exists, or starting to organize on whatever scale you have capacity for. And because of the current sort of emergency around food security, a lot of projects that might have a hard time getting funded or might have a hard time getting access to land in a normal year will be able to get land access and get some startup donation money or in-kind donations to get stuff like that rolling. And I think those are really, really important projects. Also, if you're a beginner gardener and you're working on a collective project, hopefully that will also bring some level of mentorship. Someone who's done this before and can, help you understand what needs to happen through the season and stuff like that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is also like the potentials for guerrilla gardening. If there's an empty plot near your house, or if there's some spot you're walking by every day, it also seems like one of those, along that same logic, like one of those years where you're less likely to catch trespassing charges on a vacant lot, gardening there in a year like this than you would be. I mean, maybe that's like bad advice, but I mean, that's the calculus I'd use is like, it's going to be hard to argue to a jury that you're, trespassing and destroying property in a time of a pandemic if you're using vacant spaces to grow food.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And from a guerrilla gardening perspective, if it is something where you could potentially get in trouble for using that space, either making the garden space on that lot as out of sight as possible, or as low maintenance as possible. So annual vegetables really need a lot of care, especially on not well-tended garden soil, but something like Turkish rocket or stinging nettles are something that you can establish with pretty minimal input and then just let them kind of go, for weeks at a time, and then just come back and have most of your interaction with that space be a quick harvest rather than, sort of daily tending and watering that you might have for an annual vegetable garden.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't want to get lost in the weeds, but would you consider Hablitzia to be a good, or Caucasian mountain spinach, as some people call it, a good crop for something like that?
It could be. It's a little bit more fussy about climate and microclimate than Turkish rocket or nettles. I'm around here in Maine. I would say it's generally a good bet for that. But I know people sort of from Massachusetts south, it tends to be a little bit more fussy, especially in the heat of summer. Hablitzia just cannot take, once it gets up into the mid 80s or 90s, especially if it's been dry, it gets cooked out pretty easily. So I don't see it as being quite as resilient as some of the like weedier perennial vegetables like Turkish rocket or nettles.
Right on.
Another thing to consider is container gardening. If you have a full sun balcony or a flat rooftop, or even if it's the edge of the sidewalk or something like that, where you can get a container, that can be a good option. And those containers, it could be a big nursery pot, it could be a 5-gallon bucket with a hole drilled in it for drainage. Rubbermaid storage totes make nice large containers. And when you're thinking about containers, the larger the better. Just the more soil volume you have, the easier it is to keep it watered. And the more root system the plant can have, and so the more productive that plant can be. And if a lot of outdoor container gardens get put in really hot microclimates, like asphalt rooftops or the edge of the sidewalk or whatever, and especially in those places, it can be super handy to have what's called a self-watering container. And the basic idea behind a self-watering container is that you've got your soil, your growing medium, inside of one container, and that container basically sits in another container that has a liquid water reservoir. And then there is a wick of potting soil that connects the two. And that just kind of keeps all of the growing medium evenly moist, and allows you to have this water reservoir so that you can maybe, depending on how large your reservoir is, rather than watering your container daily, you might have to water every 3 days to even eat weekly. So those can be purchased pre-made. There's a brand called Earthbox that's well constructed and lasts a long time, but they're quite expensive. So you're probably better off making those out of nested 5-gallon buckets or nested Rubbermaid totes.
Yeah, I've seen people, growing tomatoes in the double 5-gallon buckets.
Yeah. And if you are growing in a hot microclimate, growing real heat tolerant crops is very important. So things like tomatoes, or kale, not something that's going to either fry like a Hablitzia, say, or bolt super quickly like most lettuces and spinach. It's fine to do a quick round of lettuce or spinach. Just know that that's not going to be a long-lasting plant in those conditions, where like a biennial kale, you plant that, and that plant's just going to go and go and go all season, even if it gets really hot, even if it gets some drought stress or whatever.
I know, I love those. I love that fucking plant. It could just take an ass kicking and keep on feeding.
Yeah, they're pretty amazing. And if you don't have a spot for containers that's got a lot of sun, the sort of most minimal, smallest scale gardening is sprouts and microgreens, which are basically the same thing. The difference is sprouts are grown without soil, just with water in a jar, basically, and you eat the whole thing, roots and all. And microgreens are grown. They could be in a shallow potting soil, or they could be grown on basically thick blotter paper or paper towels, and you cut the tops off and don't eat the roots. You want to say anything about that? I know you grow some microgreens now and again.
Yeah, I mean, I especially in the winter, I love microgreens. There's this guy in Vermont who has this book about it's just all specifically about how to grow salad greens and microgreens in your windows. It was out on Chelsea Green. I forget what it's called, but I was listening to that guy, and I got really inspired and just started growing microgreens, especially in the winter. And yeah, they're fucking awesome, man. I mean, especially with kids and shit. Kids love microgreens, like little toddlers. But it was mostly arugula that I had the most luck with. We grew lettuce, microgreens, but it was like, what's the point? But yeah, I highly recommend microgreens. I used to think that they were like really douchey until we started like growing them in the winter, and I like it because it's like I can have my seedlings going, and then right next to it have some microgreens, and just keep fresh food going all year round. Are there any specific plants you like growing as microgreens?
I don't really grow that many microgreens, so I don't have too much personal experience with it. But I know some seed companies, I know Johnny's does this, and there's probably other options too, have like microgreens mixes. Because one of the things about microgreens is you do use a lot of seed compared to, you could have 10 kale seeds that turn into a ton of food if they're growing into mature plants. But if you have 10 kale seeds and you harvest those as microgreens, you're going to get basically nothing. So the amount of seed you use is upped. So buying, a large packet of seeds that are intended specifically to be microgreens is probably a good bet.
Yeah, I really like the microgreens mixes they have at Johnny's. I mean, the only other thing I've thought about in all this is like, because I grew a lot of mustard greens, and a lot of forest gardens have a lot of mustard greens, and it's like you always end up with so many seeds at the end of the year. If you have mustard greens growing prolifically, and so that would seem like a decent choice for either sprouts or microgreens, because it's like how much mustard greens do you really want to eat and grow?
Yeah, totally. Any brassica that you have that goes to flower is going to make a ton of seeds given the chance. And sprouts and microgreens are a great way to use that abundance of seed that's really easily produced in your outdoor garden, and you can kind of get a continued harvest from those plants even after they're dead by growing out sprouts and microgreens through the winter.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess the only other thing I would add is like, I guess I'm not that psyched on microgreens. It's a nice way to have fresh greens in the winter, but it's not like, unless you have like tons of trays going, it's not like, you're not going to really get the quantity to be able to have salads and shit made of microgreens unless you're like, going in on it,
Yeah, totally. And it's a great way to have a little bit of garden if you don't have access otherwise. It's like something that you could do. But if you do have access to soil and sun, then that's probably it's certainly gonna make a lot more food.
Word up.
So another thing that I felt was kind of lacking from that first episode was much of any discussion about soil biology. And there's when you start getting into sort of more in depth of nutrient management and all the real complexities that you can get into with growing plants, it's nice to think about some basics of soil biology, because in a situation where you have a healthy living soil, that's sort of a self-regulating community that takes care of all the needs of the plants in the community. So you don't really have to do much of anything. And what I tell people, like the number one thing to know about soil biology is that it is a self-regulating system when it's healthy, and to learn how to not screw that up, so that community can take care of itself and really take care of you. And the biggest things that humans do to screw up soil biology is disturbing the soil in a negative way. So that could be compaction, so just walking over the soil repeatedly, and certainly driving equipment like lawnmowers and cars and anything heavy, especially, that compacts the soil. I'll talk more about why that's a problem in a minute. Breaking up the soil through digging, and especially tillage, like rototilling, it's super damaging to soil. Sometimes, like, it's somewhat unavoidable to do it once to break ground for a new garden, but whenever possible, I advocate sheet mulching, because that does a lot of the same jobs of removing weeds and unwanted plants, and making way for garden plants, but doesn't do so much damage to the soil biology. And then poisoning, obviously, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides are all super damaging to the soil, and should be avoided unless it's like the last ditch effort. And even as a last ditch effort, you should be really careful about which ones you use if you ever need to go there. And when I talk about the soil being like a community, another way to look at that is through the lens of the soil food web. And if you want to take a deeper look at that, I did a free online class about soil biology that I believe was recorded. I haven't gotten the recording yet, but if you follow me on social media, I'm going to try and get that posted in the next few days if I can track down the recording. And other options are go to YouTube and look up Elaine Ingham. I believe it's Ingham is her last name, and she is a soil scientist who has a lot of really great, really interesting and accessible content about the soil food web. And one of the most important elements of the soil food web that I want to mention is the interaction between plants and bacteria and fungi in the soil. And the whole food web of the soil is essentially solar powered. It all runs on the energy of the sun, and almost all of that energy is mediated through plants, because in land-based ecosystems, plants are really, really good at harvesting the energy of the sun and turning it into sugar. And there's this amazing fact that is becoming more and more commonplace for people to understand, but even like 5 or 10 years ago, most people didn't understand that when plants make sugar through photosynthesis, in many situations, half or even more than half of that sugar gets exuded into the soil to feed the soil biology. So that's how the soil is being powered, basically, is through all the sugar that plants are pumping into the soil. And the plants don't just do this, sort of out of the goodness of their hearts. They're getting something back. And what they're getting back is water and nutrients. So plants can absorb water and nutrients just, right out of the soil, but their surface area of their roots is nothing compared to the surface area of all the bacteria and fungi that are also in that soil. And by feeding those bacteria and fungi, they can get access to a lot of the water and mineral nutrients that those other organisms have access to. So along with a huge surface area, these bacteria and fungi also have a whole nother palette of chemicals that plants can't necessarily make or access. So that could take the form of acids. So a lot of bacteria and fungi are able to exude acids, and that can change the availability of mineral nutrients from the mineral element of the soil. And also enzymes that basically do the same thing. They are chemicals that free up available nutrients. And the other thing is nitrogen. Nitrogen is a really important nutrient for plants to grow, and it's often the limiting factor in lots of systems. And we can add soluble nitrogen by using fertilizers, especially diluted urine is a real easy, accessible, and safe one. But there's also, more than 75% of every breath you take is nitrogen. So it's all around us, but it's really not biologically available because in the atmosphere, nitrogen is in the form of N2. So it's two nitrogen atoms really tightly bonded together. And it takes a lot of energy to break that bond and make that nitrogen into a form that's biologically available. But there are several types of bacteria that can do that, but they can only do it usually in association with plants because the plants can feed them enough sugar to give them the energy to fix that nitrogen. So basically, there's this whole self-regulating system that can take care of itself, and we just have to kind of set the stage to allow that to happen, and not screw it up.
And, and the only thing I guess I would add or question I would ask is, so all this, in the context of like creating a garden, people are trying to create the optimal conditions for the soil to whatever, move on its own. And the most common advice that I usually hear is always just like add organic matter, like the most generic advice to kickstarting that mycorrhizal network. Would you consider? Is that what you would call that? Like the interaction between the roots, the fungus, and the bacteria? Would you call that the mycorrhizal network?
Close. Mycorrhizal. Myco means fungus or mushroom, and rhizal means having to do with roots. So mycorrhizal is a specific type of interaction, and it is between a fungus and a plant, and the type of fungus is called a mycorrhizal fungus, and they are what's called an obligate symbiont, which means that they can only live in relation with a host plant. They're not just like out there in the soil chilling on their own. They can only survive by having this interaction with plants.
So, like, some people who get, like, really into this plant soil biology, like, year one, they'll, observe or whatever, and then they'll take some measurements of the soil to find out what's lacking. And, like, this is when a lot of people throw in, like, cover crops and nitrogen fixing, specifically nitrogen fixing cover crops. Is that usually what goes down, other than, like, just sheet mulching and...
Yeah, so one of the big advantages of using cover crops over using what I call dead mulches, like leaves, cardboard, newspaper, straw, hay, all that stuff, is those dead mulches provide habitat for certain types of soil biology, and that's great. But cover crops not only do that when they die or you kill them, but also during their life cycle, they're given that drip, drip, drip of sugar to the soil biology. So by keeping, living plants growing on, every part of your cultivated soil at all times, you're building up a higher diversity and higher populations of soil biology that just make everything better, basically. And that's awesome if you can pull that off. It does add like another kind of layer of planning and complication, and it can take a little bit of there's a learning curve to it, like everything else. But I definitely think cover crops are super useful, and definitely an essential part of sustainable and regenerative agriculture in general.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we just like our front yard, it's like all like just desert sand, and we just sheet mulched it this year, or just like yesterday actually, and just like I don't know, added way more leaves than I normally would, but it's just because it's what I had available to do like 2 layers of leaves to just help build up that soil because it's just so dusty out there.
Yeah, and getting back to that idea of like adding soil carbon, the reason that's so important is soil carbon and carbon plant waste like leaves provide not only food for a lot of soil biology, but kind of like habitat. Like if your soil is just dead and dusty, it's really hard for any soil biology to develop and catch hold, basically. And then with no soil biology to feed the plants, you can't get that like positive cycle going where the soil feeds the plant and the plant feeds the soil and you just get more and more life. You get like, a plant that's struggling to survive, doesn't have nearly as much sugar to feed that soil. And without that sugar, it's hard for there to be enough biology to feed the plant. And so it's just, you can kind of kickstart that cycle with a bunch of carbon.
Yeah, I mean, and piss too.
And carbon and nitrogen. That's the balance.
Just don't want to be caught pissing in the front yard. There's a lot of kids in this neighborhood.
Yeah. Well, that's what containers are for.
Awesome. Yeah, and I guess the only other thing I would like throw into this is I'm reading that book, Mycelium Running, right now.
Oh, I love that book.
Yeah, and it's just like this whole system that you're describing of like soil and stuff. It's reading that book reminds me of the movie Avatar, just like the way that like they lit up all these interactions between the soil and the have you seen that movie? I'm sure
I have not seen that movie.
Yeah, of course you haven't. Fucking guy. Well, anyway, I feel like Avatar's, the same way The Matrix is about society of the spectacle, Avatar is, in my opinion, pointing to mycelium running.
I may need to see it now, but I have, as of yet, avoided it in my quest to remain culturally irrelevant.
Awesome.
Okay. So another thing I didn't really talk about much last time was watering. And watering connects into this soil biology thing really in a really important way. One is like building soil carbon. The more you can do that, the less you have to water. And there's this great little factoid that I like to tell people. Unfortunately, I don't have a source for it. Or I've long since lost the source, but supposedly for every 1% of soil carbon you can build, you add the capacity to hold 1 inch of rain. And if you think about 1 inch of rain around here, that's like a really heavy soaking rainstorm. So even if you can build, 4 extra % of soil carbon, which is doable in a couple years with heavy doses of mulch and compost and such, you're adding the capacity to store what is essentially like 4 weeks of rain. So in a lot of my well-established garden beds, I basically don't need to water. Certainly all the perennials that I have, I almost never water. If there's a really serious drought, I do need to water those. But often I can get away with watering even my, annual vegetables like once every week or two. And that's because I've built up a high level of carbon in the soil. That's most of my beds are around 10% carbon, and I have a heavy carbon mulch on. So as much as you can do those things, that's really going to help. That said, especially if you're a beginner, your soil is probably not anywhere near that full of carbon, so you're going to need to pay closer attention to watering. And if you are a beginner, especially once it gets hot, I would recommend at least checking on the watering needs of your garden daily until you figure out, a good sort of schedule for watering. And the best way, in my opinion, to do that is by just kind of pulling back the mulch, and you better have mulch unless you want to be watering all the time. Pull back the mulch, and you should be able to see a color difference in the surface of the soil between when it's damp and when it's dry. And when soil starts to change color to the dry color, it's time to water. When you're watering, it's nice to do like a really deep saturating water less often rather than a light watering, every day or even multiple times a day. And the reason for that is when you water to really saturate the soil, you can get a lot of water on at one time, and then as long as there's mulch to kind of help seal that water in, hopefully you don't have to do it for days or even weeks, depending on, what part of the country you live in and how much soil carbon there is to store that water. It also encourages plant roots to delve deep into the soil where there is more resilience, more nutrition available, more natural water available, rather than to kind of keep all their little feeder roots up in the very superficial layer.
Damn. So that's why, because, I come from Colorado gardening, and in all the xeriscaping books, they tell you to water irregularly, but they don't tell you why. They don't say it's so that the roots will go down deeper into the soil. They say just do it. It makes the plants tougher. And
yeah, well,
it's good to know why.
Deep roots makes for tougher plants. Also, like constant surface watering really encourages weeds to grow, because the weed seeds that are around, the ones that are going to grow best, are up there in the surface. And by watering that surface soil a lot, but not deep watering, you'll get more weed pressure. And the one exception to this is when you've direct sown a bed of whatever, but especially carrots are very sensitive. You direct sow some annual vegetables, that does need light daily watering very frequently. Sometimes you can get away with every other day, depending on what your season is like. Like right now in Maine, you definitely don't need to water every day, because it's just so cool that the moisture isn't evaporating off so quickly. But once the plants are a little bit more established, you can cut back and water deeper and less frequently.
Let me ask you a question. Is leaves your preferred mulch for your forest garden, or are you also using wood chips?
I use both, and I guess leaves are my preferred for basically everything. I use whole leaves, which do have this issue of tending to blow away. So if you have dry whole leaves that you're trying to mulch with, some wood chips or seaweed or whatever else heavier mulch is really useful, just as kind of sprinkled on top of the leaves to keep them in place.
Right.
And if you observe carefully, you'll actually see after a few weeks or a month of those leaves being in place, these little white threads start to run through them and hold the whole mass of leaves together. And that's mycelium, which is like the body of fungi. And they'll kind of knit that whole mass together as they're digesting it and turning that back into soil available nutrients. And it also just keeps everything physically in place.
And the only other thing I would just add is I'm thinking about, we just did this big sheet mulching thing this weekend. Is when, I had the local landscaping guys who I'm just always seeing in my neighborhood just drop off truckloads of leaves. And, before winter, these leaf piles were whatever 6 feet tall. And my wife was like, "Oh man, what the fuck? No more leaves, you know." And then, but now after winter, they've all like kind of composted down, and it was just incredible to like dig into those leaves and pull out like the half decomposed leaf layer from the bottom and use that for my garden. It just made me really excited to see how. Well, because the way those leaves stay down, they're wet, they're decomposed. It's basically, you know, whatever, a couple, some processes away from being soil.
Yeah, and getting those big deliveries from landscape companies is awesome. That's such a amazing resource to have someone just drop off, and the landscaping companies are usually stoked to get rid of it, especially since they usually have to pay to get rid of it. And they usually, at least around here, have to take it to the transfer station that closes at like 3:30. So it's like really inconvenient for them, rather than saving it all up and dropping it at my house or your house, you know, at whatever time of day. It's convenient.
Yeah, like if you see the same truck in your neighborhood doing yard work, guess what? That means you're the quickest place for them to dump stuff. So
yeah. And the reason that they compost so nicely in that pile is you've got a large volume, and we have a big volume in a compost pile. It tends to heat up and compost better. But they also, landscape companies usually collect the leaves not by raking, but by mowing them. So they mow them all up, and it chops them up, which kind of helps get them started. But they also are getting a little bit of grass clippings in there, and the grass clippings are much higher in nitrogen. So rather than having this really carbon dense with a little bit of nitrogen leaf material, you're getting something that's like almost prime compost with that little bit of grass clippings in it. So yeah, that's a great material.
Yeah, just add some shit.
Yeah. All right. So those were the things that first came to mind of like what I missed on the last round. And then the other day you posted a thing on Facebook asking for listener questions, which in the past we have not gotten many listener questions. But we actually got a whole bunch of really good ones. So I want to address some of those questions because not only were you like helping that specific person, but actually a lot of these questions will, I think, be useful to, almost everybody. So the first question is, what will do well in lower light conditions? And that's somewhat of a complicated question because there's a big difference between like part sun and full shade. So most annual vegetables...
Wait, what will do well in low light conditions? Any plant in Maine. Sorry.
So like annual vegetables really need full sun. And that's usually defined as like at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sun a day. And that can be hard to pull off in a lot of places, whether you live in like a heavily forested area where there's just tall trees around, or if you live in a city where there's tall buildings around, you might have a really hard time getting that. And the plants that that's kind of most essential for are the plants that are producing a fruit that you eat. So like a tomato or a cucumber, squash, all of those are like the part you eat is the fruit, even though those are all considered vegetables from like a kitchen standpoint. They really need a lot of sun and often a lot of heat to make and ripen that fruit. And the opposite end is if you eat the leaf of the plant, it'll probably grow pretty well in part shade. And what part shade means is you're going to get some direct sunlight, but it might only be like 2 or 3, maybe 4 hours of direct sun during the day. And then the rest of the day, maybe you get like dappled shade, like there's a little bit of light, or maybe you get like pretty dense shade. And beyond those sort of like green vegetables, for annuals, a lot of perennials do really well in part shade. And my favorite is Hibiscus. And I have some Hibiscus growing in completely under the canopy of a fruit tree, so it doesn't get really any direct sun, except for maybe at the very end of the day when the sun is really low in the sky. And that plant produces so much food and over a long season. So some of my other Hibiscus get more sun, and they actually, they produce more overall. But towards the end of the summer, the leaves are like crispy, they're kind of sunburnt, they're not good to eat. But that Hibiscus that's in the shade is still going strong, and the leaves look and taste awesome. And the same can be true of annuals. So if you've got a little bit of lettuce that's in full sun, that's going to produce more, it's going to produce faster. And then maybe you've got a spot that's like kind of shady, but maybe gets a little bit of direct sun, and you can grow lettuce there too, and have it, it's going to grow a lot slower. But once the lettuce in full sun has completely bolted, and that season is done for that plant, the lettuce that was growing slower in part shade will still be in prime shape. So you can kind of use that to your advantage to some degree. If you have really shady conditions and not really any sun to work with, then you might be entirely limited to perennials. So Hibiscus, hosta, wood nettles, which is Lapertia canadensis, which is very similar to stinging nettle but more shade tolerant. Those are all really good options. Also, sweet Sicily, which is a Eurasian herbaceous perennial that has a really nice, like sweet kind of licoricey flavor to it, similar to like anise hyssop. If you've ever had that. That also is amazingly adaptable. Like sweet Sicily will grow in full blazing sun or in full shade. Definitely grows slower, a little bit less productive in shade, but there's just there's less energy to grow on.
And that the person asking that question is my friend Kay from New York, who an incredible vegan chef. I would also tell her to grow lovage. And I think people really sleep on the utility of lovage, but especially for vegans. When I was looking at like the most popular vegetable bouillon brands, the number one ingredient is lovage. And so I just started making my own vegetable bouillons all the time with just lovage. And everyone's always like, oh, lovage produces so much, I don't really know what to do with it. It tastes like shit. But it's like, all those plants, like Sweet Sicily has a lot of really cool gourmet applications in salads and stuff. And pretty much all the stuff that would grow well in a city, I feel like are like typical, like the perennials that you're talking about are like what typically are thought of for food forests. And so I would say to check out any generic, permaculture food forestry book, specifically Paradise Lot by Eric Tonsmeyer, I think is like my favorite resource on like stuff that you can grow in an urban setting. And I feel like we had arugula that perennialized in our yard, and it grew really well in the shade also.
Nice.
But yeah, it is kind of hard to grow. You're not going to be able to grow a bunch of calorie crops, I guess, and if you have limited space. So you're mostly, I think, going to try to grow things that will like offset what you'd be spending. So it's like, where do you spend your money on? Planting herbs. I feel like herbs do pretty well in partial shade as well. like oregano, like just generic cooking herbs.
Yeah, culinary herbs definitely a good way to go, especially in small spaces, because you can get a lot of enjoyment out of a few handfuls of culinary herbs compared to a few handfuls of like lettuce or potatoes or something.
And the only other thing I'll add is like kale. Also, I know I always talk about kale, but it's like that Western Front perennial kale. I had that growing in the shade, also in my Denver house, and it was the biggest kale I've ever seen in my life. It was, I posted some photos on Instagram back then, but it was huge kale, and it also came back the next year. And so, I don't know what your thoughts on this are, but like cities tend to be warmer microclimates just because of all the tar and everything. So I don't know, like if the heat can make up for what is not given by the sun. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It doesn't really make up for sunlight, but it does. It extends the season to some degree. So like out in the country, on a day it might be sunny but too cold for the plants to be actively growing, where in the city it's a few degrees warmer, and so that you get a little bit more season in the spring and a little bit more in the fall from that urban heat island effect.
Oh, okay, but what about I'm just trying to think of like what the good low light crops are for the backyard urban gardener. What about what do you think about like perennial onions? Like
definitely.
Scallions, spring onions, Egyptian walking onions.
Yeah, all those, especially the walking onions, seem to do pretty well in low light. Also chivy things, garlic chives, mouse garlic, regular chives, those all do quite well. And they're quite flavorful plants, so you don't need massive production. Like a handful is going to add something nice to a dish, and you'll definitely get a handful even with pretty low light conditions.
But also those seeds are so cheap, plant a bunch. I mean, I always talk about garlic chive, but just like shit like that, like those sorts of things are awesome, man. Like that mouse garlic I got from you, it's like maybe 3 times the size of garlic chives. It comes back about 2 to 3 weeks faster than normal chives do, and it's bigger. And so I am, and it's delicious. So I'm pumped on the mouse garlic.
Yeah, I really like that one as well. Yeah, and it seems quite popular.
Are there any other? Is there any other stuff that we're not thinking of that grows really well in shade? Would you say? I wouldn't say strawberries.
No, so I mean strawberries will do okay in part shade, but again they're one of those like you're going to eat the fruit of it, so you're not going to get a whole lot.
You know what? I had a grapevine growing in almost full shade, and it went fucking crazy because I think it just kept looking for sun, and it produced so many grapes. So I don't know if that's
nice. Yeah, that's
crazy or not, but it was like literally like if you could see where the sun hit this grapevine, you would think it wouldn't even. I threw it there like fuck it, and it was like our number one food producer as far as fruit goes.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
It was just a Concord.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought of a grape being a good shade tolerant option, but yeah, I have seen like feral Concord type grapes do quite well in like all sorts of bizarre conditions. So
see, I think the vines like seek out where the sun is and provide that sunlight for the understory or whatever that didn't have any grapes. But yeah, it really and they produce so fast. You can get fruit off of a grapevine in whatever, a year and a half. If it's a good one. So
cool. That's a good one. So the next question was, could we talk about some pest control plants? And there are kind of 3 ways that you can use plants for pest control. And specifically, we're talking about insect pests. And the first way, and which is kind of the slowest, but in the long term, I think probably the best, is by building a lot of biodiversity into your landscape and trying to have lots of plants blooming throughout the season and allowing habitat for beneficial insects. And in a lot of permaculture resources, they call these plants beneficial accumulators. So they're plants that provide food for beneficial insects. And usually what that means is the adult form of that insect drinks nectar, potentially from a specific type of plant, and by providing food for them, you allow that insect to be present, and then when it's time for that insect to reproduce, they reproduce in a way that kills pest insects. And some examples of that would be like parasitoid wasps and syrphid flies, which just lay their eggs in another insect, and then the baby wasps or flies eat that insect from the inside out. And that can happen, kind of in place, that caterpillar or whatever is just doing their thing, and suddenly they're paralyzed and eaten from the inside out. Sometimes the mother wasp will sting and paralyze the host insect and bring them back to a burrow or whatever and store that food for their babies. But whatever it is, there's, for basically every problem insect, every insect that's going to mess up your garden and eat your crops before you can eat them, there's another insect that eats that insect. So by providing biodiversity as much as possible, you increase your chances of having those beneficial insects there to take care of the problem pest insects. And at least in Maine, the two largest group of beneficials are parasitoid wasps and syrphid flies. And each one of those groups of beneficial insects has a particular plant family that they especially like to feed on. And for wasps, it's Apiaceae, or the carrot family. And for syrphid flies, it's the Brassica family. So the more Brassicas and Apiaceae plants that we have blooming throughout the season in our landscapes, the more we can hopefully, entice those beneficial insects to come hang out in our gardens and reproduce and take care of pests.
Are there any early blooming versions of those plants that you recommend?
Yeah, so Turkish rocket is a pretty early blooming brassica, followed by sea kale, and that's one of those nice function stacking things where, sea kale and Turkish rocket, awesome perennial vegetables, and they feed and attract syrphid flies. Another nice one for Apiaceae is actually parsnips. So if you grow some parsnips, they're an awesome root vegetable, super sweet, and you can leave a few to bloom, and they're just absolutely covered in all sorts of beneficial insects when they bloom. And if you want them to and let them, they readily reseed themselves. But also lovage. Lovage blooms a bit later, so ideally you'd want to have both. But you can harvest tons of lovage leaves throughout the season, spring shoots, and that plant will still, produce a flower that feeds all sorts of beneficials. Same is true of Dystania and skirret, or its North American native relative Siam suave, or hemlock water parsnip. Also, the sweet Sicily that I mentioned earlier is being really adaptable to shade. That's another Apiaceae big, nice flowers to feed those beneficials.
And I guess is arugula is part of the brassica family, right?
Arugula is part of the brassica family, and one that bolts and blooms quite quickly.
Yeah. And yeah, awesome.
So if you've got arugula blooming and it's the flavor changes, it's less mild, and you're like, oh, I don't want to eat that anymore, consider leaving some of those flowers up for those beneficial insects. So that's one way. That's sort of a structural, long-term control for pest insects. You're never going to get to 100% control with that, which is not usually a problem. But sometimes you need something that's a little bit quicker, a little bit more targeted. And there's two main plants or groups of plants that we can use to support our crop plants. And one is what's called an aromatic pest confuser. And aromatic pest confusers work by sort of confusing the chemical signature of plants so that pest insects have a harder time finding them. And this works because insects aren't visually oriented like we are. Like if I'm looking for an apple in the landscape, I look around and I can notice the visual signature of what an apple tree looks like, and I can say, oh, there's an apple. Insects are much more chemically focused, so they use their antennae to sense the chemical signature that's given off by all plants. And some plants put out a lot of aromatic compounds, and those can kind of mask or confuse the chemical signatures of other plants. So the most basic use of this is growing in polyculture. So when you've got a bunch of different kinds of plants growing together, it's a little bit trickier for the pest insects to find their host plants. But you can also take a more active role, and the only plant that I have ever really heard good reports about doing this with is tansy. Tansy is pretty weedy. You definitely don't want to go to seed in your vegetable garden. But otherwise, very easy to grow plant. And you can actually harvest a bunch of tansy. And if you've got any growing, it's easy to have a lot of it. You can harvest a bunch, kind of smash it up in a 5-gallon bucket, pour some boiling hot water onto it, let it sit for a couple hours, and then take that tansy tea, which it smells really strongly. And once it's cool, you filter it and spray it on the plants that you want to protect. And what that does is it just really effectively masks them from being found by pests. Once the pests are on the plant, tansy tea isn't going to do anything. So it's purely a preventative, and you do have to redo it every few days or every week, mostly depending on how much it rains, in order for it to remain effective. But I have heard some great results, especially from my friend Tom Vigue, who's been on his land since the 70s, grows a lot of his own food, and he has successfully avoided dealing with Colorado potato beetle on his potatoes by using this tansy tea. So, there are other aromatic plants. If you don't have tansy available, anything with a really powerful scent like mints, mountain mint, feverfew, probably some types of chrysanthemums, the more potent ones, geranium, would all be worth a try as an aromatic pest confuser. And then you've got straight up pesticides. And the sort of classic pesticide plant is tobacco. So you can grow tobacco as a pesticide plant, harvest and dry the leaves, and then make a tea out of that, just like you would with the tansy, and spray that on as sort of a last resort. And the downside of that is tobacco is a broad range insecticide. So I would, only use that as a last resort unless it's on houseplants, because with houseplants you don't really have the beneficial insects there to worry about.
A lot of people use neem, or you hear the cayenne and water mixture recommended.
Yep.
It's that those things would have the same impact as the tobacco, whereas the tansy is a much more.
Yeah, they're much more gentle. I would say neem and cayenne are less risky than tobacco.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought those up. Those are definitely like safer and for the beneficial insects than the tobacco. There are also a couple of bacteria-based pesticides that are available commercially, cheaply, easy to use, that are also worth considering as a sort of last line of defense. And I think the most important one is usually called BT, which stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. And that's a pretty common soil bacteria. And the reason that it's a really nice pesticide to use, if you've got to use a pesticide, is that it is, it's biologically produced, doesn't stick around in the environment for more than a few days, and it's really highly targeted. It's only effective against lepidopteran caterpillars, so only moths and butterflies. So if you have, cabbage loopers or any of these caterpillars that can really mess up a brassica crop, and obviously the first line of defense is just like picking off the caterpillars and smushing them or feeding them to chickens or whatever. But if it kind of got out of hand and you really want to save that crop, BT it has kind of a minimum negative consequences on other insects. It's minimally dangerous to humans. You should be careful and not get it on your skin. Certainly don't get it in your eyes or mouth. But it's much less dangerous than sort of most of the synthetic pesticides. And some issue or some pests that you would be likely to use this on would be any of the cabbage loopers, diamondback moth, any of those brassica caterpillars, tomato or tobacco hornworms that get onto nightshades or Solanaceae plants, and also cutworms. Cutworms are a type of soil-dwelling caterpillar that they come out at night and they eat the stems of seedlings. So if you've ever had seedlings that just disappeared and maybe all that's left is a sad wilted leaf left on the soil surface, that is very likely to be cutworms. And they can be a really frustrating pest. And a friend of mine, Jacob, taught me this trick for getting rid of cutworms, which is you take a little bit of cornmeal and you dampen it with a mixture of water, molasses, and a little bit of BT concentrate. And then you just kind of, you put in a peanut butter jar or whatever with a couple of holes drilled in the top, like a giant salt shaker, and you just kind of shake that cornmeal BT molasses solution, or it's it's like crumbly, damp cornmeal. You shake it around the areas where you're having problems with cutworms, and the cutworms come out at night and they're attracted to the molasses, and they eat the cornmeal, which has that BT in it, and it kills them. So I found that to be highly effective. And if you're having trouble with cutworms and don't want to do that, another option is to put little cardboard or paper collars around your seedlings like a section of paper towel or toilet paper tube works really nicely. And as the cutworms move across the soil surface, they'll bump into that collar and just go somewhere else. For whatever reason, they don't climb over that. So that's some thoughts on dealing with pest control.
Weird. I've never even heard of cutworm. What about the? How do you feel about people the mara, whatever that plant is that people say produces something in the soil to keep away soil insects? It's an edible flower. It begins with an M.
Marigold?
Yeah.
I have not had any luck with companion planting with marigolds. There's all sorts of like companion planting things that people are like, oh, you plant these two things together and you totally avoid such and such problems. And I have not had good luck with those. It's not to say that they don't work at all, but they didn't work for me, so I generally don't recommend them.
I think just like to tack on to what you're saying though, like as a general principle, at least what is promoted in permaculture is like if you have good variation, lots of different kinds of plants, and you've created an interesting, diverse biology in your yard, your yard's ability to they say healthy plants fight off pests, and a healthy little microclimate is more able to fight back against pests than a blank tar yard.
That's absolutely true. Like biodiversity should be your first line of defense. And once you build that biodiversity, or if it's already there, you'll just have less pest issues, and hopefully building towards the point where you have no significant pest issues.
Like in Colorado, my most significant pest issues was just aphids on my brassica. Like I couldn't even grow broccoli or cauliflower or anything because there'd just be so many aphids. But what I started doing is just planting like rows of scallions or spring onions or bunching onions between the kale with nasturtium and lavender and things like that, like in the corners of those beds. Just to, because I read in a book that, planting nasturtium drives away pests, and it worked for a while. But out here, aphids aren't really a problem. So, and I don't know if that's just because I'm in a much more lush environment now, or if that's just like aphids just are more kept under control here because there's more bugs. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure because I've only ever really grown in this climate. But yeah, aphids don't seem to be a huge pest issue here. Someone did ask about Japanese beetles specifically. And for Japanese beetles are a pretty tough insects. Like they are difficult to kill by any means. So they're a little bit tricky. There is a product called milky spore, which is I think it's a nematode that you spread around the Japanese beetle infested areas, and that nematode lives in the soil and kills the Japanese beetle larva. But I've heard pretty mixed results. I think it's fairly expensive. There's also Japanese beetle traps that use a pheromone to lure in the Japanese beetles. I've also heard fairly mixed results with those, where you catch a lot of Japanese beetles, but it also just draws every Japanese beetle from all around to that spot. So it that's another kind of mixed bag. My personal experience with Japanese beetles is that when we started gardening here, 12 or so years ago, Japanese beetles were a huge problem. And when we planted a lot of our fruit trees, they were getting basically defoliated by Japanese beetles. And as we built better soil and stronger soil biology and more established plants, the Japanese beetles became less and less of a problem. And we also noticed that a lot of the Japanese beetles were starting to be parasitized. So if you're ever hand-picking Japanese beetles, which unfortunately is like a time-consuming and annoying, but probably the best, control for moderate Japanese beetle infestations, we're noticing all these little white spots on the Japanese beetles. And if you're handpicking, you see those ones with white spots on them, you want to leave those ones alone, because those white spots are arachnid fly eggs. And so every time you've got one of those, that arachnid fly is going to kill that beetle anyway, and then a new arachnid fly will hatch out that will hopefully lay more and more eggs to help to control that Japanese beetle population.
I would just throw one other thing in there that worked really well for me with Japanese beetles, and that was putting a bird feeder near where the Japanese beetles were. And I would just put a full bird feeder near wherever they were attacking, whether it was my grapevines or a tree or something, and the birds would come right down and they would fucking eat the Japanese beetles, and then they'd move on to the next place. I mean, eventually I just said, fuck it, and I got one of those pheromone bags, and the pheromone bag worked incredible.
Nice.
It took care of them.
Cool. And that is also a good point about the biodiversity thing and using that as a strategy. Birds eat a ton of insects. And so bird feeders to attract birds, but also bird houses, because while adult birds often eat, a lot of fruit and seeds and all sorts of different things, depending on what species they are, baby birds need a lot of protein. And so parent birds, collect a lot of insects. So having not only birds that visit, but birds that are breeding in your yard can be very helpful to controlling insect populations.
That's awesome. Yeah, we just put in our first birdhouse this weekend.
Nice. I built and put up a bunch of birdhouses a couple years ago, and we've had some chickadees and nuthatches in there, and that was really cool. But this year it looks like we finally have some nesting bluebirds, which is really exciting because they're so beautiful. And this male bluebird is like right outside my house all day, every day, and it's really fun to watch them.
Yeah, we have these ducks. I think it's the same pair of ducks that come back every year, and I'm just trying to I think I want to try to build one of those duck boxes to try to get them to stay, because man, having random wild ducks joining your flock is fucking fun.
Nice. Yeah, the kind of ducks that nest in boxes are often wood ducks, and they are so spectacular looking. They're really neat. All right.
Oh yeah, no, I don't have those. Those are spectacular. Look like aliens, man.
Yeah, they're so colorful and they're wicked fancy looking.
Yeah, those are definitely not what I have. Mine are just like mallards or whatever.
Yeah, so they're definitely the most common. But they nest on the ground. All right. So another question was best crops for canning or freezing. So that's basically any crop can be canned or frozen. So some things to think about are what grows well in your soil. So for beginner gardeners, I definitely recommend planting a wide diversity of crops. Obviously, you want to plant what you like. So if you just don't like okra, then don't plant any okra.
Or
or
radishes.
Yeah, radishes super easy to grow, very quick turnaround.
But don't
if you don't
good.
Like them. I do like daikons, but red radishes I don't grow anymore because I just don't like them.
Yeah, no offense. Just had to get some fun.
Dig radishes. In.
Yeah.
But for canning, you can actually can almost any vegetable. Most people are really most familiar with canning tomatoes, which are an awesome vegetable to have canned. But canned corn used to be super common, like canned sweet corn. I really like dilly beans, which are like a vinegar pickle made out of green beans and dill. Those are super tasty. Something to consider is if what you want to be canning is not really acidy, then you either need to acidify it using citric acid or vinegar, or it needs to be pressure canned. And you can, on a small scale, you can pressure can in an Instant Pot. But if you want to be doing a lot, you'll probably need to purchase or borrow a pressure canner, which is a really nice thing to have, but pretty expensive. And for freezing, there's, to have really well frozen produce takes a little bit of knowledge, and I recommend the book Putting Food By, that has really great guidelines. Also, the USDA has like a home food preservation website that has excellent information on like how to properly freeze and can any crop you can imagine, basically. For freezing, again, having a particular piece of equipment is super handy, and that is a vacuum packer. It's not awesome that it uses plastic that's mostly disposable. You can reuse the vacuum pack bags, but frozen food that's vacuum packed lasts so much better and stays so much higher quality than food that's stored in like a mason jar or a Ziploc bag or something. It really is like a huge difference. So if you're intending on putting a lot of food by in the freezer, I highly recommend vacuum packing it. Wow. So, figure out what you can grow a lot of, what you want to have in the freezer, and then, figure out some best practices for how to freeze and can those crops the best using the resources that I mentioned.
Yeah, and I guess the only other thing I would add into that's another quiver from the Aaron Parker weaponry is, you mentioned stinging nettle earlier in the episode, and we did a whole episode on stinging nettle. But that's a plant that you can dry it. It's high in nutrients, and you don't need to freeze it or can it. You can just dry it and then use it the same way you would, use spinach in soup or something. So that's
totally.
Something else to throw out there.
And that same technique works with a fair amount of leaf vegetables, of drying them and then reusing them in soups and stir fries and whatnot. So dried kale is totally useful. Dried spinach, all that stuff can work the same way. Yeah, definitely thinking about like what's the most high value use of the space and time you have available. So like if you've got a very limited amount of space, I think several successions of salad greens, or use part of it for a succession of salad greens and some kale and a couple of tomatoes is going to be I think of a lot more benefit to you than to use that space to grow like 2 winter squash plants. But if you've got more space, more time, then you can definitely think about, putting stuff aside. And along those same lines, there was also a question about how to store roots and storage vegetables. There's a great book that I think is just called The Root Cellaring. I don't know the name of the author off the top of my head, but it's published by Chelsea Green. Like most books that I mentioned. And it has tons of great information. But sort of the gist of storing roots is they need kind of refrigerator temperatures and high humidity. If you have a basement, you might be able to section off a part of it to keep it cooler and damper than you would want your basement to be, and store them there. But if you don't, some other options are burying a barrel or a busted refrigerator in the ground, and using that as sort of a moderated cold storage for roots. Some of the other crops that are not roots can actually be stored quite well just at room temperature or in like the coldest, darkest spot in your house. So like onions, garlic, winter squash are all things that store well at near room temperature. We have a closet that's a little bit drafty, where all those things store beautifully. And butternut squash in particular seems to store unbelievably well. We have one on the counter right now that looks totally good. I'm excited to cook it up and see if it is still good, because it's a year and change old. It's like, let's say a year and a half old. And it's just been sitting on the floor underneath a table for that whole time at room temperature. So there are some varieties that are they've been bred for good storage qualities, and even in suboptimal conditions, they can just hang out for a really long time.
Could you eat that?
Yeah, I'm going to. After that long of storage, I'm thinking it might be kind of like suboptimal. Like it's maybe not going to be the best squash, but it looks totally fine. It's still firm. It's not like gone by. It just kind of got forgotten, and I'll be interested to see if it is any good.
And hey, you know what? I just wanted to throw in one more thing, because I do feel like most of the people listening are in cities and who don't necessarily have access to a lot of land. So I guess like that was like the main thing I was thinking about going into this is, so when you're mentioning squash, I was just thinking back to my old yard in Denver, and I would just plant squash just along my fence and train it to grow up my fence, because it was like, who cares? There's nothing growing on there anyway. And even though it wasn't getting full sun, I still got a lot of squash. So I would, that's like something else you can do. It's like, if you're, because who cares? It's like, even if it only produces 2 little squashes on a wall, at least it's something, it's something you watched grow. You watched it limp along all summer and then shrivel up and
yeah. Squash can be really hit or miss, and it really depends on pest pressure, at least around here. So we used to be able to grow hundreds of pounds of squash with like no effort, and then these squash bugs showed up, and now growing squash is, not impossible, but quite annoying, because we get these squash stink bugs that just lay eggs all over the squash leaves, and then you get this like crowd of little baby squash bugs you have to go and squish or get rid of. And I've taken to using like a dust buster type vacuum, and I just go out at night when they're all sluggish and just like vacuum them up. But it's a pain in the ass.
Those fucking things, I'd never seen them before, and they're so cool looking, actually.
Yeah.
They're like weird little black and white bugs, and it was like all of a sudden they're fucking everywhere. And you're like, damn, fuck, and then try to feed them to chickens. The chickens don't even really do much with them.
Yeah, and they like stink, and they're really, I've yet to be able to attract any sort of animal that wants to eat them. Yeah, which has been frustrating, but Such is life.
Yeah.
All right, we got one more question, and then we can maybe wrap it up for today. And that question is, someone wanted us to talk about basic seed starting, potting up, and hardening off of seedlings. So I talked a little bit about starting seeds in the last one, and using lights or natural light, but a little bit more about growing those seedlings on before you can plant them out. And little seedlings are much more tender than more established plants, and the watering is definitely more finicky, because plants in the ground, it's unless you have really clayey soil or it rains all the time, it's kind of hard to overwater them, because if you put a ton of water on, it basically just drains away. And if it's like puddling, then it's obviously too much. But with seedlings, if you keep them really damp all the time, they can frequently get this fungal disease that will kill them called damping off disease. And so with seedlings, they really are something that you want to check on every single day, and you want them to be sort of like evenly damp but not soaking wet. Or if you have had problems with damping off, like if you had a beautiful little seedling and then one day it just like shrivels up and wilts, you want to reduce your watering a little bit. And I have had a definite reduction in issues with damping off since I started treating my seeds with a product called MycoGrow, which I get from Fungi.com, which is Paul Stamets' company. He's the guy who wrote Mycelium Running, that book that Tim mentioned earlier. And it's just like a mix of powdered spores of mycorrhizal fungi that you're inoculating these seedlings with. And the more beneficial fungi and bacteria you can add to those seedlings, they kind of colonize the seedlings and they colonize the soil, and there's less room for problematic bacteria and fungi to grow in that habitat. So that helps a little bit.
Whoa, I've never even heard. So when you say you treat the seeds, do you mean like you soak them in it or something?
Well, it comes as a powder, and I think last time I ordered it was like $3 or $4 for a little baggie of powder, and that's enough for like, half a pound of seed or something. So a little bit goes a long way, and it's very inexpensive. And what I do is I just take a pinch of the powder and put it in the seed packet or whatever container before I start planting them, and I just shake it up, and then the seeds come out all covered in this spore powder.
Wow.
And I don't think it's super important to inoculate plants with mycorrhizal fungi in soil, because there's already tons of mycorrhizal fungi in there. It certainly isn't going to hurt anything, but if you're growing in potting soil, there's not going to be much in the way of mycorrhizal fungi in there, because there haven't been living plants actively growing in that soil anytime recently. So inoculating those seeds, it's not essential, but it's a nice step, and it's cheap and easy. So why not go for it?
That's awesome, man. I love that. Yeah, because like I've just been using peat moss that's just like devoid of nutrients or anything, and I've been noticing a little bit of mold creeping up. And if only we'd fucking done this.
And so if you are using some sort of peat or coir based potting soil that doesn't really have any nutrition to it, fertilizing seedlings a little bit is probably a good idea. I try to avoid using just like what are called salt form fertilizers, stuff like Miracle Grow. those can produce, big, huge plants. But what you're kind of doing is you're short circuiting that soil food web that we talked about earlier. So it's kind of like, you can survive just hooked up to an IV, but your whole digestive system is going to really atrophy if you're getting all your nutrients through a needle in your arm. And that's basically what you're doing with salt form fertilizers, is you're taking the fungi and the bacteria mostly out of the loop. So I would try and be fertilizing with something that's, biologically based and as complex as possible, so that you're feeding the plant through soil biology still, so that when that plant goes into, a living soil situation, it's not having to totally rebuild the way that it gets nutrition, which takes basically time. Like plants that are raised on Miracle Grow in sterile conditions will certainly adapt to living soil. It just, you'll get faster and better results if they're kind of used to that already. So don't use a ton of fertilizer. Use it very dilute. I like fish hydrolysate with kelp, which is readily available at most nurseries and hardware stores, at least around here. In a pinch, certainly dilute urine, and you shouldn't ever smell that if it's dilute enough. So for seedlings, probably like 1 part urine to 10 parts water, and that just gives some available nitrogen and some phosphorus and potassium to get those plants growing.
So,
or a little sprinkle of finished compost too.
So I'm looking at all this stuff online: organic liquid seaweed and kelp fertilizer supplement, like something like that. Is it?
Yep.
Yeah, I've never heard of this. That's cool.
And then another thing is potting up. So after your seedlings, or I guess we should start with germinating and popping up. So once you see something pop up out of the soil, usually the first thing you see are these two, for most plants, seed leaves, and those are called cotyledons. And those are the leaves that were kind of present in the seed embryo. And then after those first two leaves, you'll start to see true leaves, which have whatever the typical shape for that plant is. But you'll notice a difference. And then once you've got 2 or 3 sets of true leaves, it's time to start thinking about what's going on underneath the soil, because as the top of the plant is growing, the roots are also growing. And if those plants are in like a very small container, they can get root bound pretty quickly, which means that the roots have like filled up all the available space and are starting to like weave together into a knot. And that's generally a bad thing. And the reason that that's especially bad is when roots run out of space to grow, there's a hormonal shift that happens in the plant that basically says to the plant, like, oh, we're out of room to grow, so stop growing, which is exactly what you don't want to happen to your seedlings. So once the plant's pretty established with a few sets of leaves, you can usually kind of support the surface of the soil and turn it upside down and squeeze the pot a little bit if it's a flexible plastic pot, and just pop the whole root ball out of the pot without disturbing it much, and use that as a way to test and look at the roots and see what's going on. And actually, if you look at my Instagram feed or Facebook today, there is a picture of me doing just that with a plant, and you can see, like, okay, that's what a good root system looks like. If there were substantially more roots, or if they were starting to knit together, it'd really be time, or even past time, to pot that up, which means taking the plant from a smaller pot and moving it to another pot that's, 150 times or 200 times, twice the size of that pot, so that that plant doesn't make that shift into, oh shit, stop growing because we're out of room to grow. So if you've ever had like a tomato plant that's like 6 inches tall, but still in a tiny little pot, and it's blooming, that's what happened. The plant realized it was out of room to grow, and it was like, oh shit, time to, make flowers and reproduce before I die. If that plant had been potted up, it would still continue growing at a faster rate.
Can you rip those flowers off and then expect it to keep growing? Because I feel like I used to do that back in the day when I get like a...
Yeah, so if you have plants that are blooming too quickly, for the most part, you can just pinch off those flowers and, it'll go back to continue growing vegetatively, but they'll probably be back pretty soon. And when you're repotting plants, and this is true of even more so, like if you're repotting house plants that stay in pots permanently, you really want to disturb the roots a little bit if they're root bound. So if you've got like just a mass of tangled up roots, and you are like, oh shit, it's root bound, I need to put it in a bigger pot. You put it in a big pot, it'll actually often just stay all tangled up unless you kind of break up those roots a little bit, and you can use, a shovel or a knife or whatever just to kind of score the outside of the root ball, or just, if they're, seedlings, you can usually just break it apart a little bit with your hands. You don't want to destroy the root system. You just want to sort of cause enough disturbance to stimulate new roots to grow.
What about cutting the bottom of the roots?
Yeah, that's fine. You don't want to lose a lot of root mass. So, you don't want to like cut off half of the root ball. That would be bad. But if you're cutting off just like the bottom 5 or 10%, that's totally fine.
Awesome.
All right. So one other thing about growing seedlings and then planting them out is a process called hardening off. So let's say you're growing, seedlings in a windowsill or under lights in your house, your basement, or whatever. And then, it's the right time of year to start setting them out. A really easy mistake to make is to just take them and, go straight from the house, straight into the ground. And unfortunately, that will kill most seedlings. They need to kind of get adapted a little bit slowly to outdoor conditions. And that can be done kind of in a hurry over a period of a couple days. But ideally, it should take, like 5 to 7 days. And the way you do that is you don't want to start on like a hot, sunny, windy day and just put them outside. You want to start on kind of an overcast, moderate day, and just put your seedlings outside for a couple hours and then bring them back inside. And then the next day you can do a couple more hours, and then bring them back inside. And then the next day it's, 5 or 6 hours and then bring them back. And, over a period of, let's say 3 to 7 days, you want to get them to where you're leaving them outside in the pot, 24 hours a day. And I usually like to leave them, in a pot outside for a couple days, around the clock before planting them, and then they're ready to plant. And something that can make hardening off a little easier on the plants is if they can get some sort of stimulus while they're still inside. So if you have like an oscillating fan that kind of goes back and forth that you can put blowing on your seedlings, even if it's, just for an hour a day or something, just that stimulus of like simulated wind helps them build stronger stems and be used to having air movement. And if that's not an option, even just like gently running your hand across the trays of seedlings, just so that they're getting that movement can help build stronger stems and make them more resilient and easier to harden off.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, you do that with weed plants. You put the fan on them.
Yeah. It also, having that lots of air movement can help reduce the chances of fungal diseases.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I fucking just learned a whole bunch. It's always funny to me when, talking about something as generic and simple as like how to start a garden and all this simple stuff, but then it's like, it's just always interesting, that, you've always got things to learn. I think I know how to start a garden, but then hearing how all the little things you do, it's like, it's like a fucking onion, man. Just keep peeling that shit.
Yeah, there's always more to learn, for sure. Always more interesting things to observe and do better next year.
Yeah, and that's kind of my favorite thing about all this stuff is just like they could just put you on this endless educational journey.
Yeah, and I myself love experiments, so I love to try new varieties, new techniques. So I'm always scheming on something new.
Yeah, well, it's so funny. Ever since the Joseph Lofthouse interview, it like gave so much more excitement for me to plant like generic shit. So I had like 5 different kind of peas, and so I just did one of each kind of snap peas, and see what kind of mutant Lofthausian snap peas, and it's just
yeah. I was also super inspired by that. I'm gonna try some storage onion breeding. So I've pulled out like the nicest looking storage onions from what's left that I grew last year. And I don't even remember what varieties they were, but I'm just going to plant those, and I'm going to hit up some of my farming and gardening friends to see if they have any nice looking storage onions left to add to the mix.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's just another level of that kind of hacking. It's fucking awesome, man.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what happens with it.
Totally.
And thank you to everyone who asked questions. This podcast would have been about 20 or 30 minutes without all your questions, and they made a really excellent jumping off point for some great discussions, and hopefully our answers were useful to you.
Yeah, and always happy to answer more. So feel free to pop. We should just get a Propaganda by the Seed email account that like forwards to both of our emails or something, but don't need one more thing to check online. But yeah, pop us an email. I'm SOLE@SOLEONE.org. Any questions about this shit? Pop me an email or pop Aaron an email. What is it?
Yep.
Edgewood Nursery.
It's edgewoodlandscapes@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram and Facebook as Edgewood Nursery.
Yeah. So if again, we want to help people grow food. So if you got questions, hit us up.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, is that a wrap?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's everything I wanted to cover, and yeah, we can do this again soon.
Yeah, and if you want to get any of the cooler perennial sort of plants that Aaron was mentioning, you can hop over to the Edgewood Nursery store, use the code SOULCAST, and get 10% off on your order.
Yep. Absolutely, and that's edgewood-nursery.com. Because there actually are several other Edgewood nurseries in other states, and I get people calling and asking me really weird, incongruous questions before I realize that they're looking for a totally different business.
Well, there's only one Edgewood Nursery.
And no, I don't sell boulders.
Edgelord Nursery. The most ultra leftist nursery. Awesome. All right, man. Well, here, and thank you for everyone for your questions and for listening to Propaganda by the Seed.
You have 1 minute remaining.
This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain with the Final Straw radio show on the Channel Zero Network. Abby Hoffman once said, "The ground you're standing on is liberated territory. Defend it." If he were still alive, he'd be binge listening to the Channel Zero Network, too. Channel Zero Network, because every countdown ends at 0.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what?